The night of October 15th, 1895 would be remembered as the night the Library of Whispers revealed its first deadly secret. Deep within Ashford Manor, 7 levels beneath London, amidst shelves guarding forbidden knowledge and cursed manuscripts, Tobias Crow lay motionless on the black marble floor. His body was surrounded by open books, their pages stained red. In his right hand, he still held a golden quill. In his left, half a silver key, broken in half. Above him, carved into the ancient wood of the main table, a message glowed in the flickering candlelight. The first has fallen, 6 to go. The library's chilly air carried the scent of fresh ink, melting wax, and something more sinister, the unmistakable scent of death. And in the shadows between the endless shelves, something watched, something that had waited decades for this moment. 6 months before that fateful night, Detective Alistair Finch sat in his leather armchair on Baker Street, watching the rain drip down the fogged windows of his residence. At 38, Finch had solved cases that baffled Scotland Yard: impossible murders, unexplained disappearances, crimes that defied all logic. But on that gray April afternoon, as the fire crackled in the grate and the clock struck precisely 5, he had no idea he was about to receive the invitation that would change his life forever. The doorbell rang. His butler, the discreet Mr. Pemberton, entered carrying a silver tray on which lay an envelope sealed with black wax. The seal was unusual, a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros, symbol of eternity and infinite cycles. Finch picked up the envelope with curious fingers, feeling the weight of the high-quality paper, and when he opened it, he immediately recognized the elegant, firm handwriting of someone accustomed to giving orders, not asking for them. "Dear Mr. Finch," the letter read, "my name is Lady Cordelia Ashford, and I urgently require your services. Something of a disturbing nature has occurred on my estate, something I cannot entrust to conventional authorities. My head librarian, Mr. Tobias Crow, has disappeared under circumstances that defy rational explanation. He left behind only a blank book and a broken key. I know your reputation as a man who sees beyond the obvious, who reads between the lines of the impossible. Come to dinner with me tomorrow at 8 o'clock at Ashford Manor, Belgravia. Bring your sharp mind and your absolute discretion. What I have to show you cannot be seen by ordinary eyes. Yours truly, Lady Cordelia Ashford." Finch reread the letter 3 times, his gray eyes taking in every detail. The uneven pressure of the pen on certain words, the barely perceptible smear of candle wax in the lower corner, the slight tremor in the signature that betrayed carefully concealed nervousness. He smiled. Finally, something interesting. Ashford Mansion loomed against the London night sky like a Gothic cathedral forgotten by time. Its pointed turrets pierced the low-hanging clouds, and its illuminated windows blinked like watchful eyes, watching for Alistair Finch's arrival. The estate occupied an entire block in Belgravia, surrounded by stone walls covered in black ivy that seemed to have a life of its own in the flickering light of the gas lamps. When Finch stepped from the carriage, the air was thick with damp and something else, a smell of turned earth, of old books, and of long-buried secrets. The butler who greeted him was a tall, cadaverous man with sunken, unblinking eyes. He led the detective through corridors lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors, all with the same piercing, unsettling gaze. It was like being watched by ghosts who hadn't yet realized they were dead. Lady Cordelia Ashford waited in the dining room, and when Alistair Finch first saw her, he understood why powerful men had ruined fortunes and reputations for her. It wasn't just her beauty. Ebony black hair in an elaborate coiffure, porcelain skin, lips as red as aged wine. It was the sharp intelligence that shone in her emerald green eyes, the poise of someone who never apologized for existing, the deep, controlled voice that turned every word into a veiled command. She wore a burgundy velvet dress that seemed to absorb the candlelight, and around her neck was a string of black pearls that Finch immediately recognized as extremely rare. Tahitian pearls, each worth more than most houses in London. "Mr. Finch," she said without extending her hand, just inclining her head slightly, "I thank you for answering my call. I know men of your caliber don't often accept invitations blindly." His voice had a barely perceptible accent, something continental, French perhaps, polished by years of British education. Dinner was served on French china, wild mushroom soup, roast pheasant with red wine sauce, blackberry tart. But Finch barely touched her food, her eyes watching Lady Ashford's every movement, every calculated pause, every smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke of her late husband, Lord Edmund Ashford, an obsessed bibliophile who had spent the family fortune acquiring rare and forbidden books from around the world. She spoke of the subterranean library he had built beneath the mansion, 7 levels carved into the living rock, a labyrinth of knowledge few living people had ever seen in its entirety. And then, as the clock struck 9, she finally spoke of Tobias Crow. He was more than a librarian, she said, her fingers caressing the stem of her wine glass. He was the guardian, the only one who knew every corridor, every shelf, every secret buried in those depths. 3 days ago, he came down to catalog a new acquisition, a medieval manuscript my late husband had obtained under questionable circumstances. Tobias never returned. She slid an object across the table, a small book, bound in black leather, with no title on the cover. When Finch opened it, the pages were completely blank except for a single sentence written in red ink that still looked wet. He knows what you did. The night of October 15th, 1895, would be remembered as the night the Library of Whispers revealed its first deadly secret. Deep within Ashford Manor, 7 levels beneath London, amidst shelves guarding forbidden knowledge and cursed manuscripts, Tobias Crow lay motionless on the black marble floor. His body was surrounded by open books, their pages stained red. In his right hand, he still held a golden quill. In his left, half a silver key, broken in half. Above him, carved into the ancient wood of the main table, a message glowed in the flickering candlelight. The first has fallen, 6 to go. The library's chilly air carried the scent of fresh ink, melting wax, and something more sinister, the unmistakable scent of death. And in the shadows between the endless shelves, something watched, something that had waited decades for this moment. But to understand how Alistair Finch arrived at that moment of horror, one must go back 6 months, to that rainy April night when it all began. When the candles went out in the dining room of Ashford Manor and the sound of footsteps echoed from the depths, Lady Cordelia neither screamed nor flinched. She remained motionless in the darkness, her breathing controlled, as if she had expected it. Finch, on the other hand, already had his hand in the inside pocket of his jacket, where he kept a small revolver he rarely used. The footsteps grew closer, ascending the stairs that led to the lower levels of the mansion. They were heavy, shuffling steps, as if the one making them carried an immense weight or was injured. The cadaverous butler hurried into the room with a lit candelabra, and the light revealed something that made even Finch, accustomed to disturbing scenes, squint. In the doorway to the dining room stood a man, or what was left of one. He was tall and thin, wearing a black suit covered in dust and cobwebs, as if he'd spent days in a forgotten basement. His face was pale as wax, his eyes sunken and glassy, his lips cracked and stained with something dark. In his trembling hands, he held a stack of yellowed papers covered in strange symbols and frantic notes. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, broken, as if he hadn't used his vocal cords in a long time. "Lady Ashford," he whispered, and each word seemed to cost him immense effort. "I found it, on the 7th level. The manuscript." He was right. Everything was right. His legs buckled and he staggered forward. Finch moved instinctively, catching the man before he fell. Up close, he could see better. The nails stained with dirt and ink, the deep scratches on his arms, the eyes that seemed to have seen something the human mind was not meant to process. "Tobias," Lady Ashford said, her voice finally betraying emotion, relief mixed with horror. "Where have you been? What happened?" Tobias Crow, the missing librarian, looked up at her, and Finch saw something in that look that disturbed him deeply. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. Reverence and absolute terror. "He's awake," Tobias whispered, a tear sliding down his dirty cheek. "After all these years, he's finally awake. And now we will all pay." Lady Ashford ordered Tobias taken immediately to one of the guest rooms on the 2nd floor, where a maid prepared hot water, clean clothes, and strong tea. The librarian was in a state of profound shock, alternating between moments of disturbing lucidity and periods of catatonic silence, where he simply stared into space with eyes that seemed to see through walls. Finch insisted on being present throughout the entire process, observing every detail. The way Tobias flinched when someone mentioned the library, the way his hands shook uncontrollably as he held the teacup, the way he muttered Latin words that Finch couldn't quite decipher. By the time they finally got him to bed, it was past midnight, and the storm outside had intensified, thunder rattling the mansion's windows. Lady Ashford led Finch back into the hallway, gently closing the bedroom door behind him, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw his mask of control begin to crack. "He's been missing for 3 days, she said, her voice low and strained. 3 days, Mr. Finch. And when he comes back, he's like this, talking about things that have been agreed upon, manuscripts that were agreed upon, payments that are coming." She pressed her fingers to her temples, a gesture of exhaustion she tried to disguise as elegance. "I need you to understand the gravity of what's happening here. The Order of the Guardians is not a social club for eccentric collectors. We are the heirs to a tradition that dates back to medieval times, when certain knowledge was considered too dangerous to exist freely in the world." She walked to a window, watching the rain drip down the glass. "My late husband dedicated his life to gathering this knowledge. Grimoires of black magic, treatises on forbidden alchemy, manuscripts the church would burn without hesitation, texts that kings and emperors killed to possess or destroy. And the seventh level holds the worst of it all." Finch crossed his arms, his analytical mind already processing information, connecting dots. "And what exactly is on the 7th level that could reduce a rational man to that state?" Lady Ashford turned to him, the hallway light casting deep shadows across her face, making her look 10 years older. "A book," she said simply. "A single book my husband spent 20 years searching for, which cost him his fortune, his sanity, and eventually his life. He called it The Testament of the Watcher, purportedly written by a monk in the 13th century who claimed to have made contact with something beyond the veil of reality. Something ancient, something that has watched humanity since before recorded history." She paused, as if the next words were physically painful to utter. "My husband believed the book wasn't just an account. He believed it was a ritual, a form of communication. And 3 weeks before Tobias disappeared, an anonymous package arrived containing the last missing page of the manuscript, the page that supposedly completes the ritual." Finch felt a shiver run down his spine, not from superstitious fear, but from the dawning realization that he was dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than a simple disappearance. "And you think Tobias completed the ritual?" It wasn't a question. Lady Ashford nodded slowly. "And if he did, then something responded." At that moment, a scream rent the silence of the mansion, high-pitched, desperate, coming from the room where they had left Tobias. Finch and Lady Ashford rushed back, followed by the butler who emerged from the shadows like a specter. When they opened the door, they found the librarian standing over the bed, pointing at the window with wide eyes of utter terror. "He's out there!" Tobias screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "He followed me! He knows I told you! He knows!" Finch ran to the window and looked down at the rain-soaked garden 3 stories below. At first he saw nothing but trees swaying in the wind and darkness, the impenetrable London night. But then, in the dim light of a distant street lamp, he saw a figure standing completely still in the middle of the garden. A tall figure, dressed in what looked like a black cloak or cape, its face hidden in shadow. And even from a distance, even through the rain and darkness, Finch had the unmistakable, unsettling sensation that the figure was looking directly at him, watching, waiting. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, the figure had vanished, as if it had never been there. But in the wet grass where it had been, even from afar, Finch could see something that shouldn't have been possible. Footprints burned into the earth, smoking in the rain, forming a circular pattern, a symbol. The same symbol that had been on the seal of Lady Ashford's letter, the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. The next morning, Ashford Manor looked different in the grey light of London's early morning. What had been gothic and mysterious the night before now seemed simply old and tired. Peeling walls, dusty portraits, an air of aristocratic decay that no amount of fortune could completely disguise. Finch had spent the night in one of the guest rooms, but he had slept little, his mind racing over the burned footprints in the garden, Tobias's condition, Lady Ashford's words about rituals and observers. When he came down for breakfast, he found his hostess already seated at the table, dressed in a dark green riding habit, reading correspondence with the same controlled expression as always. It was as if the frightened woman from the night before had never existed. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," she said without looking up from her letters. "I hope you rested adequately. We have a long day ahead of us." Finch helped himself to strong coffee and toast, watching her with renewed curiosity. "How is Tobias this morning?" Sedated, Lady Ashford replied, finally setting aside her letters. Dr. Helena Voss came at dawn and administered laudanum. He was convulsing, speaking in languages even Father Thorne couldn't identify. She took a delicate sip of tea. Helena is a member of the Order, a forensic physician with a particular interest in hysteria and possession. If anyone can help Tobias regain his sanity, it's her. Finch leaned forward, fingers intertwined. Lady Ashford, I need complete transparency if I'm to solve this case. How many members exactly does this order have? Who are they? And why do I have the feeling there's so much more at stake here than the disappearance of a librarian? Lady Ashford smiled, a small, almost sad smile. As perceptive as your reputation suggests. Very well. The Order of the Keepers of Forbidden Knowledge currently has 7 active members. I am one of them. Tobias was another. The remaining 5 will arrive this afternoon for an emergency meeting I have called. She stood and walked to a bookshelf, from which she took out a red leather album. Allow me to introduce you. She opened the album on the table, revealing photographs and meticulous notes. The first image showed a middle-aged man with a gray beard and intense eyes, dressed in formal Victorian clothing. Lord Edmund Blackwood, Lady Ashford said, occultist, collector of medieval grimoires, expert in summoning rituals. He inherited the family fortune at 20 and spent every pound acquiring texts that most people would consider madness or blasphemy. He is arrogant, dangerous, and utterly brilliant. The second photograph showed a stern-looking woman, her hair tied in a tight bun, wearing wire-framed glasses. Dr. Helena Voss, a forensic physician, trained in Heidelberg, expelled from the German medical community for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. She came to London 5 years ago. She is fascinated by texts on forbidden anatomy, treatises on resurrection, and the boundaries between life and death. The third image was of an elderly priest, thin as a scarecrow, with eyes that seemed to burn even through the photograph. Father Silas Thorne, renegade theologian, former member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the Vatican. He was excommunicated for heresy after publishing a treatise arguing that certain demons mentioned in apocryphal texts were, in fact, entities that predate Christianity itself. He knows more about the occult than any man alive. The fourth photograph showed an exotic woman with dark, piercing eyes, wearing colorful shawls and elaborate jewelry. Madame Evangeline Devereux, French medium, tarot reader, expert in necromancy and communication with the afterlife. Some call her a charlatan. Those who have witnessed her seances know she is much more than that. The fifth image was of a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, with round glasses and an expression of restless intelligence. Professor Nathaniel Gray, linguist, expert in dead languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, languages unspoken for millennia. If there's a text no one can decipher, Gray is the one we call. Lady Ashford closed the album slowly. And then there's me, the widow, the hostess, the guardian of the library my husband built with obsession and which may have been his undoing. She looked directly into Finch's eyes. These are the 7 guardians, Mr. Finch. And if Tobias was right, if something really has been awakened on the 7th level, then we are all in danger. Because whatever is down there now knows we exist. Finch studied each photograph carefully, memorizing faces, searching for revealing details. When exactly will they arrive? Lady Ashford consulted the pocket watch hanging on a gold chain. At 3 o'clock, we'll have tea, discuss the situation, and then, Mr. Finch, you'll have the opportunity to question each of them. She paused. But before that, there's something I need to show you. Something I found in Tobias's room this morning, hidden under the mattress. She removed a small, brown leather-bound notebook from her dress pocket, its pages yellowed and stained. Tobias's personal journal. He documented everything. Every descent to the 7th level, every discovery, every change he felt happening. She handed the notebook to Finch with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Read it, Mr. Finch. Read it and understand why I'm so frightened. Finch opened the diary to the first page and saw Tobias's neat handwriting, dated 3 weeks ago, September 15th, 1895. Today the package arrived, the final page. After all these years, the will is complete. Lord Ashford would be ecstatic, but I feel only dread, because now that I hold it in my hands, now that I can read the final words of the ritual, I understand the terrible truth. It is not a book about watching, it is a book about being watched. And once you read those final words aloud, he knows you exist, and he never stops watching. Finch spent the next 2 hours locked in Lady Ashford's personal library on the second floor, far from the underground library, reading every page of Tobias Crow's diary with meticulous attention. What began as orderly academic notes, book cataloging, manuscript descriptions, conservation observations, gradually transformed into something far more disturbing. The entries became erratic, the handwriting deteriorated, and the content shifted from objective observations to increasingly paranoid confessions. September 20th read one entry. I've descended to the 7th level for the 10th time this month. I stay down there longer and longer. There's something about the atmosphere of that place, something that pulls you closer. The testament rests in its glass case, and I swear I can hear it calling, even through the thick glass, even through the silence. Finch turned the page, his eyes scanning the increasingly narrowed words. September 23rd, I dreamed of the Watcher again. He's standing at the end of an endless aisle of bookshelves, and though I can't see his face, I know he's smiling. I know he's waiting for me to complete what Lord Ashford started. The following entries were even more alarming. Tobias described sensations of being followed inside the library, of hearing footsteps that echoed his own, of seeing shadows that moved regardless of the light. He mentioned intense headaches, unexplained nosebleeds, and a growing compulsion to read the entire testament, especially now that he had the final page. September 28th. I can resist no longer. Academic curiosity has turned into physical necessity. I need to know. I need to understand what Lord Ashford saw before he died. I need to know if the Watcher is real or just a legend concocted to protect dangerous knowledge. Tonight, when the mansion is asleep, I will descend to the 7th level, and I will read the final words. Finch felt a shiver run down his spine. This was the last coherent entry. The following pages were a chaos of scrawled symbols, Latin phrases, frantic drawings of eyes, hundreds of eyes, covering every inch of the paper. And in the midst of that chaos, a single sentence in English, written over and over until it filled 2 entire pages. He sees me. 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 Finch closed the diary slowly, his rational mind struggling with the growing unease he felt. He didn't believe in curses or supernatural entities. His career had been built on logic, deduction, and the understanding that behind every seemingly impossible mystery lay a rational explanation. But there was something about Tobias's diary, something about the methodical progression from sanity to madness, that deeply disturbed him. He had seen men go mad before, from guilt, from trauma, from mental illness, but this was different. This felt deliberate, as if something had systematically dismantled Tobias's sanity, piece by piece. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Lady Ashford entered, now dressed in more formal attire to welcome guests. "The members of the Order have begun arriving," she announced. "Lord Blackwood and Professor Grey are already in the drawing room. Dr. Voss is with Tobias. Madame Devereux and Father Thorne should be arriving any moment." She noticed the diary in Finch's hands. "Disturbing, isn't it?" Finch nodded. "Disturbing is a mild word. Lady Ashford, I need to ask a direct question, and I require an honest answer." Lady Ashford crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Ask." Finch stood, clutching the diary. "Your husband, Lord Edmund Ashford, how exactly did he die?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken meaning. Lady Ashford walked to the window, gazing out at the garden where they had seen the mysterious figure the night before. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, almost a whisper. Officially, it was a heart attack. He was found in his study, sitting at his desk, a quill still in his hand. The coroner found nothing suspicious. She paused for a long time. "But I was there, Mr. Finch. I found him, and I can tell you what the official report doesn't mention." She turned to him, her eyes moist, though no tears fell. His eyes were open, wide open, and the expression on his face wasn't one of pain or surprise. It was one of absolute terror, as if he'd seen something no human being should see. And on his desk, open to the last page, was the Watcher's testament. Incomplete, of course. The final page hadn't arrived yet, but he was reading it, and whatever he'd read, it killed him. Finch absorbed this information, connecting it with everything else he had learned. "And you didn't think it was relevant to mention this last night?" Lady Ashford smiled bitterly. "Mr. Finch, if I had begun our conversation by saying that my husband died reading a cursed book, and now my librarian has gone mad doing the same, Would you have taken me seriously? Or would you have dismissed me as a hysterical widow with an overactive imagination? She was right, and Finch knew it. He would probably have declined the case. How many people know the true circumstances of your husband's death? He asked. Lady Ashford counted on her fingers. Me, Tobias, who found the body with me, and the other 5 members of the order, whom I trusted completely. She walked toward the door. Which means, Mr. Finch, that if someone sent that final page anonymously, knowing what it would do, knowing that Tobias wouldn't resist the temptation to complete the ritual, then the culprit is among us. One of the guardians is a murderer, or worse. She opened the door, and the sound of polite voices and suppressed laughter drifted up from downstairs. Come, it's time to meet the suspects. The main drawing room of Ashford Manor was a stately room with a high ceiling decorated with faded frescoes, crystal chandeliers casting golden light on dark mahogany furniture, and bookshelves filled with leather-bound first editions. When Finch descended the stairs with Lady Ashford, 3 figures were already there, chatting in low tones as they helped themselves to tea and small sandwiches prepared by the servants. The first to notice their arrival was Lord Edmund Blackwood, and Finch recognized him immediately from the photograph. Tall, with an impeccably trimmed gray beard, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit with a waistcoat embroidered with silver thread that formed symbols Finch didn't recognize. His eyes were an icy blue, piercing and calculating, the kind of look that assessed and judged in seconds. Cordelia, he said, his deep, cultivated voice carrying an aristocratic accent. You finally honor us with your presence. And this must be the famous Mr. Finch, the detective who solves impossibilities. He didn't offer his hand, just inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was more condescending than respectful. Beside him stood a younger man, visibly uncomfortable with the formality of the situation. Professor Nathaniel Gray, exactly as in the photograph, with round glasses that magnified his brown eyes and ink-stained fingers. He held a teacup in both hands, as if needing something to anchor him. Mr. Finch, he said, his voice softer, almost shy. I've heard a lot about your work. Fascinating, really. The application of deductive logic to situations that seem to defy reason. He pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous gesture. Though I must admit that this particular case, well, it may defy even your considerable logic. The third figure was Dr. Helena Voss, who had just come down from tending to Tobias. She was exactly as Finch had imagined, stern, efficient, with a presence that commanded immediate respect. Her dress was practical, dark gray, without unnecessary adornments, and she carried a leather medical bag that looked as if it had seen decades of use. Mr. Finch, she said with a slight German accent, extending her hand firmly and professionally. I hope I can bring some clarity to this situation. Tobias is stable for now, but his mental state is worrying. I've seen cases of hysteria, severe psychological trauma, even what some would call possession. But this is different. It's as if something has rewritten his mind from the inside out. Before Finch could respond, the front door opened with a dramatic bang, and a colorful figure entered like a swirl of fabric and perfume. Madame Evangeline Devereux was even more striking in person than in the photograph. Loose black hair falling in curls over her shoulders, silk shawls in shades of purple and gold, rings on nearly every finger, and dark eyes that seemed to see right through you. Forgive my delay, she said in a thick French accent, her voice husky and theatrical. But the cards warned me that today would be no ordinary day. The tower, the hanged man, and death, they all appeared in my morning reading. Terrible omens, my friends. She swept the room, her eyes landing on Finch with disconcerting intensity. Ah, the skeptic. I can sense your disbelief from here, monsieur. You believe nothing you cannot touch, measure, prove. But beware, there are things in this world that touch you back. She smiled, revealing perfectly white teeth, and some of them don't like to be watched. Finch was about to answer when the last figure entered silently, almost like a shadow. Father Silas Thorne, thin as a scarecrow, wearing a worn black cassock, holding an ancient Bible under his arm. His face was hollow, lined with years of fasting and contemplation, but his eyes burned with a fanatical intensity that made even Blackwood seem subdued. Lady Ashford, the priest said, his voice surprisingly strong for someone so frail in appearance. I received your message. I came as soon as I could. He looked around the room, his gaze resting briefly on each person present before settling on Finch. You are the investigator, the man of reason. It wasn't a question. I hope your reason is strong enough for what is to come. Because what Tobias awakened on the 7th level respects no logic, Mr. Finch. It respects no science. It respects only one thing, power, and those foolish enough to summon it without understanding the price. Lady Ashford clapped her hands once, cutting through the growing tension in the room. Gentlemen, madam, please be seated. We have much to discuss in little time. She gestured to the long dining table that had been set with tea, coffee, and an assortment of foods that no one seemed interested in touching. Slowly, reluctantly, the 5 members of the order took their places around the table. Finch immediately noticed the dynamic. Blackwood sat at the head of the table opposite Lady Ashford, assuming a position of authority. Gray sat as far away from everyone as possible, clearly uncomfortable. Dr. Voss chose a chair that gave her a view of the entire room. Madame Devereux sat beside Finch, too close to be casual, her scent of jasmine and something darker enveloping him. And Father Thorn remained standing for a long moment before finally sitting, placing the Bible on the table like a shield. Finch remained standing, preferring the advantage of observing everyone from a higher vantage point. "Thank you all for coming," Lady Ashford began, her hands clasped on the table. "As you know, Tobias Crow disappeared for 3 days and returned last night in a state of severe shock. Dr. Voss can confirm that his mental condition is critical." Helena nodded. "He is sedated, but even unconscious, he mumbles constantly. Words and languages I don't recognize, and occasionally, names. Our names." A heavy silence fell over the room. "What kind of names?" Gray asked, his voice trembling slightly. "All of ours," Helena replied coldly. "Edmund, Cordelia, Nathaniel, Silas, Evangeline, my own name." He repeats them like a litany, as if reading from a list. Blackwood tapped his fingers on the table impatiently. "And what exactly was he doing on the 7th level that caused this?" "Tobias has always been meticulous, careful. He's not the kind of man to go mad without reason." Lady Ashford took a deep breath. He completed the testament. The final page arrived 3 weeks ago, sent anonymously, and Tobias, unable to resist his curiosity, descended to the 7th level and read the entire ritual aloud. The impact of those words was immediate and visceral. Gray dropped his cup, which shattered on the floor. Madame Devereux made the sign of the cross, muttering something in French. Father Thorn closed his eyes and clutched the Bible tightly. Even Blackwood, always in control, paled visibly. But it was Dr. Voss who spoke first, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "So we're all dead." He summoned the Watcher. "And now we're all on the list." The chaos that followed Dr. Voss's statement was immediate and revealing. Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp sound that echoed through the room. "Impossible. The testament was just theory, academic speculation. None of us truly believed the ritual would work." His normally controlled voice now carried a note of barely concealed panic. Madame Devereux laughed, a humorless, almost hysterical sound. "You didn't believe, Lord Blackwood? Then why did you spend 20 years searching for that damned final page? Why did we all dedicate our lives to collecting these texts if we didn't believe in their power?" She turned to Lady Ashford, her eyes shining with something between fear and accusation. "Who sent the page? Who knew where to find it? Because this was no accident, Cordelia. Someone wanted the ritual completed. Someone in this room." Father Thorn opened his eyes slowly, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of a funeral sermon. "Madame Devereux is right. This was deliberate. The Watcher cannot be summoned by accident. The ritual requires intention, will, and precise knowledge of words that have not been spoken in centuries. Someone orchestrated this, and now we will all pay the price for one's arrogance." Finch observed everything with meticulous attention. Every reaction, every chosen word, every revealing gesture. Gray was trembling visibly, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Dr. Voss remained outwardly calm, but Finch noticed how her eyes moved constantly, assessing each person in the room as a potential threat. Blackwood tried to regain his aristocratic composure, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. Madame Devereux looked genuinely terrified, her usual theatricality replaced by real fear. And Father Thorn, the priest, seemed almost resigned, as if he had already accepted some inevitable fate. "Silence," Finch said, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. Surprisingly, everyone obeyed, turning to look at him. "You're all reacting with emotion when you need logic. Let's establish facts." He began to pace around the table, his hands behind his back. "Fact 1. 3 weeks ago, someone anonymously mailed the final page of the will to this mansion. Lady Ashford, did the package have any markings of origin? Postage stamp? Handwriting on the address? Lady Ashford shook her head. None. It was left at the front door overnight. None of the servants saw who delivered it. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and the address was typed. Finch nodded. Fact 2. Tobias had exclusive access to the 7th level. Is that correct? Not exactly. Gray interrupted, his voice still shaky but gaining strength. Tobias had the master key, yes, but each of us has a key that opens the first 6 levels. Only the 7th required Tobias's special key, or the presence of Lady Ashford, who has a duplicate key. Finch turned to Lady Ashford. You mentioned the key was found broken. Where is your copy? Lady Ashford touched the necklace around her neck, and Finch noticed for the first time a small silver key dangling among the black pearls. Here, always with me. I never take it off. Finch continued his circuit of the table. Fact 3. Tobias disappeared for 3 days. During that time, did anyone in this room notice anything unusual? Visit the mansion? Have contact with Tobias? The silence was broken by Blackwood. I was here 4 days ago. I came to consult a 15th century grimoire on the 3rd level. Tobias accompanied me, as he always does. He seemed distracted, anxious. I asked if everything was okay, and he said he was just tired. Dr. Voss added, I saw him 5 days ago. He came to my office complaining of insomnia and headaches. I prescribed a mild sedative. He mentioned he was working on an important project but didn't elaborate. Madame Devereux leaned forward. He came to me a week ago for a tarot reading. He said he felt something was about to change, that he needed guidance. The cards I drew for him were dark, the Tower, the Devil, and Death. I warned him not to make rash decisions. He didn't listen. Father Thorne spoke last. Tobias came to me to confess 10 days ago. I can't reveal what he said. The seal of confession is sacred, but I can say this. He was struggling with a terrible temptation, and I feared even then that he would succumb to it. Finch stopped behind the empty chair that should have been Tobias's. So you all had contact with him in the weeks before he disappeared? You all knew he was under pressure, and you all had access to the mansion. Gray raised his hand timidly, like a student in class. Mr. Finch, with all due respect, are you suggesting that one of us sent the page and manipulated Tobias into completing the ritual? But why? If the Watcher is real, if the ritual truly works, then we put our own lives at risk. What reason would anyone have? Finch turned to him. That, Professor Gray, is exactly the right question. Cui bono? Who benefits? He looked at each member of the order. Lady Ashford, your husband died under mysterious circumstances while reading the incomplete will. You inherited his fortune and this mansion. Perhaps you wanted to know if whatever killed him was real, or perhaps you wanted revenge against something you don't understand. Lady Ashford paled, but didn't answer. Finch continued. Lord Blackwood, you have dedicated your life to the occult. What greater validation of your beliefs than proving the impossible is real, even if the price is high? Blackwood clenched his fists. This is absurd. Finch ignored him. Dr. Voss, you were expelled from the medical community for unauthorized experiments. What better experiment than testing the boundaries between life, death, and what lies beyond? Professor Gray, you study dead languages. The Testament is written in a language no one can fully decipher anymore. Perhaps you wanted to be the first to translate the entire ritual. Gray opened his mouth to protest, but Finch had already moved. Madame Devereux, you claim to communicate with the afterlife, but what if you wanted to prove your powers are real, not just parlor tricks? And Father Thorne, you were excommunicated for heresy. What better way to prove the church wrong than to invoke something it denies exists? The silence that followed was thick enough to be cutting. Then Blackwood slammed his hands down on the table. Brilliant, Mr. Finch. You've established that we all have theoretical motives, but that gets us nowhere. We need evidence, not speculation. Finch smiled, a cold, calculated smile. I agree, and there is a very simple way to obtain evidence. We need to go down to the 7th level. We need to see exactly what Tobias saw. We need to read the will. The horror that spread across the faces around the table was unanimous and absolute, and it was at that moment that the mansion's electric light flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. And in the darkness, a voice, not from anyone in the room, but from somewhere below, from the depths of the mansion, whispered a single word that echoed off the walls like an omen. Go down. When the lights came back on 30 seconds later, no one had moved, but everything had changed. The fear that had once been theoretical, academic, was now visceral and undeniable. Madame Devereux was pale as wax, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary Finch hadn't noticed before. Gray had taken off his glasses and was compulsively cleaning them, a nervous gesture that revealed his growing panic. Even Blackwood, always arrogant, had lost his aristocratic bearing, hunched over the table as if he'd been physically struck. Dr. Voss was the first to regain her composure, her clinical voice cutting through the shocked silence. Collective auditory hallucination. Extreme stress can cause shared psychological phenomena, especially in groups under intense emotional pressure. There is documented precedent, but her voice lacked conviction, and Finch noticed how her fingers clutched the medical bag as if it were an anchor to reality. Father Thorne stood slowly, clutching his Bible to his chest. It wasn't a hallucination. It was an invitation. Or an order. The Watcher knows we're here. He knows we're discussing him, and he wants us to come down. His voice had the quality of someone who had already accepted his fate. Perhaps this is what he's always wanted. Not just to be summoned, but to be witnessed by all of us. Lady Ashford stood, regaining her authority as hostess. We're not going downstairs now. It's getting dark, everyone is emotionally shaken, and it would be unwise to explore the 7th level in this condition. She looked at Finch. Mr. Finch, I suggest everyone spend the night here at the mansion. I have enough rooms. In the morning, with cooler heads, we can decide our next move. Blackwood shook his head vigorously. Stay the night? In this mansion? After what we just heard? You're crazy, Cordelia. I'm going to my club in Mayfair, where there are rational people and doors that lock properly. He was already moving toward the exit when Finch spoke, his voice calm but charged with authority. No one leaves. Everyone turned to look at him. By what authority? Blackwood demanded, his face flushing with indignation. Finch walked until he was between Blackwood and the door. With the authority of someone who understands that if one of you is responsible for this, for sending the page, for manipulating Tobias, for orchestrating whatever is happening, then letting you disperse would be allowing you to destroy evidence, coordinate stories, or worse. He paused, and with the authority of someone who realizes the front door is locked from the outside, the silence that followed was broken by Gray rushing to the front door and frantically pulling on the handle. It didn't budge. He tried the nearest window, locked, and when he tried to force it, he realized it had been nailed shut. My God, he whispered. We're trapped. Lady Ashford ran to check, her face draining of color. That's impossible. I didn't order anything locked. The servants wouldn't do that without my permission. She pulled the bell cord to summon the butler. They waited. No one came. She pulled again. Harder. Silence. Dr. Voss moved methodically through the room, checking every window, every secondary door. All locked, all sealed. When she returned, her clinical expression had been replaced by something closer to genuine fear. We're completely cut off, and I don't see any of the servants. Where is your butler, Lady Ashford? Where are the maids? Lady Ashford shook her head, her voice breaking. I don't know. They were here this morning. Pemberton served the coffee. Cook made the sandwiches. I saw them. Madame Devereux began to laugh, a high-pitched, almost hysterical sound. Don't you understand? This is part of the ritual. The will doesn't just summon the Watcher. It creates a secluded space, a theater where he can work. We're in his web now, and he won't let us out until he finishes what he started. Finch forced his mind to remain rational, to not give in to the panic he saw spreading through the others. There's always a logical explanation. Someone physically locked the doors. Someone instructed the servants to leave or hide. Someone in this room is orchestrating this. He turned to Lady Ashford. How many servants work in this mansion? She tried to focus, her mind fighting fear. 5. Pemberton, the butler. Mrs. Dawson, the cook. 2 maids, Mary and Elizabeth. And the gardener, old Thomas. But he lives in the guest house out back. Finch nodded. So 7 people, plus us. We need to find them. If they were instructed to leave, we need to know by whom. If they're hiding, we need to know why. And if... He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. If something happened to them, we need to know what. Father Thorne made the sign of the cross. We should stay together. To separate would be folly. Blackwood, regaining some courage, agreed. For once, I agree with the priest. Strength in numbers. Let's search the servants systematically, room by room, floor by floor. Finch considered. No, splitting up is exactly what we must do. Everyone protested simultaneously, but he held up his hand. Think. If anyone here is responsible, they won't act while we're all together. But if we split up in pairs, with each pair watching the other, then the culprit will be forced to reveal themselves or remain inactive. Doctor, Voss nodded slowly. There's logic to that. But how do we decide on pairings? Finch had already thought of that, based on who's least likely to conspire together. Lady Ashford, you'll come with me. We'll check the servants' quarters and the kitchen. Lord Blackwood and Father Thorn, you'll check the upstairs and the guest rooms. Dr. Voss and Professor Gray, you'll check the personal library and the offices. Madame Devereux, he paused, you'll check Tobias's room, see if he's awake, if he's okay, and look for anything he might have hidden. More diaries, notes, anything. Evangeline swallowed. Alone? Finch glanced around the room. Someone needs to stand guard at the entrance to the underground library, to make sure no one goes down without us knowing. He fixed his gaze on Blackwood. Unless you volunteer to stay with Madame Devereux? Blackwood hesitated, then shook his head. No, your distribution makes sense. Finch checked his pocket watch. It's 4:15 in the afternoon. We'll meet back here in exactly 1 hour. 5:15. If anyone doesn't return, the others will search immediately. Understood? Everyone nodded reluctantly. As they prepared to part ways, each grabbing candles or oil lamps in case the lights failed again, Finch noticed something that made him pause. On the table where they had been sitting, among the untouched teacups and plates, was something that had definitely not been there before. A book, small, bound in black leather. And when Finch opened it, his blood ran cold. The pages were no longer blank. Now they were filled with names, written in red ink that still looked damp. 7 names, the names of everyone in the room. And next to Tobias Crow's name, a single word, complete. The discovery of the book with the names caused a moment of collective paralysis. Everyone crowded around Finch, looking over his shoulder at the pages that shouldn't have been written. The 7 names were arranged in a circle, like the hands of a macabre clock, and in the center was a symbol Finch recognized from the seal of the original letter, the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. But there was something more disturbing. Beside each name was a Latin word, different for each person. Next to Tobias Crow was complete. Next to Edmund Blackwood was superbia, pride. Next to Helena Voss was avaritia, greed. Nathaniel Gray had acedia, sloth. Evangeline Devereux had luxuria, lust. Silas Thorne had ira, wrath. And next to Cordelia Ashford was invidia, envy. Finch's name wasn't on the list. Gray was the first to speak, his voice shaking. The 7 deadly sins. He branded us with the 7 deadly sins. His breathing was rapid, on the verge of a panic attack. But why? What does that mean? Father Thorne snatched the book from Finch's hands with surprising force, his eyes darting frantically over the pages. It's a judgment. The Watcher doesn't just see us, he judges us. Each of us has been weighed and found guilty of a specific sin. He looked at Blackwood. Pride. You've always considered yourself superior, Edmund. Superior in knowledge, in lineage, in right. Blackwood recoiled as if slapped. How dare you? But the priest had already turned to Dr. Voss. Greed. Not for money, Helena, but for knowledge. You dissected corpses without permission, desecrated tombs, all to satisfy your insatiable hunger to understand death. The doctor didn't answer, but her eyes narrowed dangerously. The priest continued, turning to Gray. Laziness. Not of the body, Nathaniel, but of the soul. You have the gift of tongues, which you could have used to enlighten the world, but you chose to hide in dead texts, avoiding the weight of responsibility. Gray sank into a chair, unable to protest. Thorne turned to Madame Devereux. Lust. Not just of the body, Evangeline, but of power. You seduce people with promises of otherworldly knowledge, feeding on their hopelessness, their need. Evangeline covered her face with her hands, tears streaming through her fingers. Finch watched with growing unease. The priest was crumbling, his facade of control shattering to reveal something darker beneath. And when Thorne turned to Lady Ashford, his voice was laced with venom. Envy. You envied your husband's love of books, envied the attention he gave to the library instead of you. And when he died, you envied even his death, the peace he found while you remained trapped in this mansion, in this life. Lady Ashford paled, but stood erect. And you, Father? What is your sin? Anger, the book says. Anger against what? Thorne laughed, a joyless sound, full of bitterness. Anger against God, Anger against a church that cast me out for seeking the truth. Anger against a world that calls folly what it does not understand. Yes, I carry anger. And perhaps that is why I was chosen to be here, to witness the judgment. Finch had heard enough. Enough. This is exactly what whoever is orchestrating this wants. For us to turn against each other. For us to lose focus. He took the book back from the priest's hands. This was placed here by someone physical, someone in this room, while we were distracted by the lights out. It's not magic. It's psychological manipulation. But even as he said it, a part of his rational mind was beginning to waver, because he had watched everyone in the room when the lights went out. No one had moved. No one could have placed the book there without him noticing. Blackwood regained some composure, clearing his throat. Finch is right. We're wasting time with theatrics when we should be looking for concrete answers. We stick to the plan. We split up, find the servants, and meet back in an hour. He was already moving toward the stairs, Father Thorne reluctantly following. Dr. Voss and Professor Gray left for the private library, Gray still visibly shaken. Madame Devereux hesitated, looking at Finch with eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You're not on the list, monsieur. Have you ever wondered why? Perhaps because you're the unsuitable piece in this game. Or perhaps," she paused, "perhaps because your judgment hasn't arrived yet." Before Finch could respond, she had already ascended the stairs toward Tobias's room, her colorful shawls disappearing into the dim light of the hallway. Finch was left alone with Lady Ashford. She watched him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Fear, yes, but also something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or appraisal. "Do you truly believe there's a rational explanation for all this?" she asked softly. Finch tucked the black book into his inside pocket. "There always is. The question is whether we'll have enough time to find her before whoever's behind this completes their plan." He offered his arm. "Come on, we need to find her servants, and we need to do it quickly, because I have a growing feeling that this hour we've given ourselves may be exactly what the culprit has been waiting for." They descended the service stairs toward the kitchen and servants' quarters in the mansion's basement. Not the deep basement where the library was located, but the service level just below the main floor. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with plain wooden doors on either side. Lady Ashford carried an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the bare stone walls. The first door led to the kitchen, a large room with a still warm wood stove, pots hanging on the walls, and a work table covered in flour and half-baked bread dough. "Mrs. Dawson was making bread," Lady Ashford observed, touching the dough. "It's still soft. She couldn't have left long ago." Finch examined the scene carefully. Everything seemed normal. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of a hasty departure. It was as if the cook had simply stopped mid-work and left. But to where? And why? They continued down the hallway, checking each room. Pemberton's room, the butler, impeccably tidy. The bed made with military precision, no personal belongings visible. The maid's room, 2 narrow beds, clothes folded in simple trunks, a prayer book on the bedside table. The cook's room, surprisingly cozy, with embroidery on the walls and the scent of lavender, all empty, all abandoned. But there were no signs of violence, no evidence of a hasty escape. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. "This doesn't make sense," Lady Ashford murmured, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. "Where did they go? Why would they leave everything behind?" Finch was about to answer when he heard something that made his blood run cold, coming from somewhere deeper underground, beyond the servants' doors, beyond the kitchen, the sound of a door opening, and then, echoing off the stone walls, rising from the depths like a sigh from hell itself, a voice. The same voice they had heard before, but now it wasn't just saying a word. Now it was singing, an ancient melody in a language Finch didn't recognize but somehow understood on a primal, terrifying level. It was a song of welcome, and it was getting closer. They gathered on the main floor, before the wrought iron door that marked the official entrance to the underground library. It was an imposing door, 10 feet tall, covered in alchemical symbols carved into the black metal, pentagrams, concentric circles, letters in alphabets no modern university taught. Lady Ashford held the silver key that hung from her necklace, but her hands were shaking so badly that Finch had to help her insert it into the ornate lock. The mechanism turned with a deep, resonant click, and the door began to open slowly, its ancient hinges groaning like something alive awakening from a 1,000-year slumber. Chilled air escaped the opening, carrying that unmistakable smell of antiquity, mold, old paint, and something more visceral. The smell of fear crystallized over decades. Beyond the door, a stone staircase spiraled downward, lit by oil lamps that inexplicably were lit, though no one should have been downstairs to light them. The flames flickered as if breathing, casting shadows that seemed to have a life of their own on the damp stone walls. "Who goes first?" Gray asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Finch stepped forward. "I'll go. Lady Ashford, you'll come right behind me with the lamp. The others stay together and alert. If anything happens, if anyone goes missing, we'll call immediately. Understood?" Everyone nodded, though the fear was palpable in the air like a physical presence. Finch began descending, each footstep echoing down the narrow staircase. The temperature dropped with each step, and soon he could see his own breath forming clouds of steam in front of his face. The walls were lined with built-in shelves, crammed with leather-bound books of every color: blood red, moss green, coal black, some so old the spines were crumbling to dust. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, the staircase opened onto the first level of the library. It was a vast, circular room with bookshelves stretching from floor to vaulted ceiling, connected by iron spiral staircases and narrow walkways. Dark wooden reading tables were scattered throughout the space, some still with books open, as if ghost readers had just departed. But what struck Finch most was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active, oppressive silence, as if the air itself were holding its breath. "The first level," Lady Ashford said softly, her voice sounding strangely muffled. "Texts on alchemy and hermetic philosophy. Relatively harmless." She pointed to another staircase on the opposite side of the room. "We need to keep going down. The 7th level is at the bottom." They traversed the first level quickly, no one wanting to stay longer than necessary. The second level was similar in structure, but the books here were different. Medieval grimoires, treatises on ceremonial magic, illuminated manuscripts with illustrations of demons and angels in eternal battle. Gray stopped before a bookshelf, his fingers reverently touching the spine of a particularly ancient volume. "This is the Picatrix," he murmured admiringly. All complete copies were thought to have been destroyed by the Inquisition. Dr. Voss tugged at his arm. "We have no time for academic admiration. Keep moving." The third level was darker, the lamps more widely spaced, and here Finch began to notice something disturbing. Footprints in the dust covering the stone floor. Fresh footprints, multiple, going in every direction. Some were clearly men's boots, possibly Tobias's, but others were smaller, lighter, and some didn't seem entirely human. The toes too long, the stride too long. Blackwood noticed too. Someone's been here recently, several people. His voice had lost all arrogance, replaced by genuine fear. "Or several things," Madame Devereux added, crossing herself. The fourth level was where the atmosphere changed dramatically. The shelves here held not just books, but objects. Human skulls used as bookends, vials containing liquids of impossible colors, ancient surgical instruments stained with rust or worse, ritual masks with expressions of frozen agony, and the walls were covered in paintings. Ancient frescoes depicting rituals, sacrifices, hooded figures gathered around altars where things that should have no form took on substance. At the center of many paintings, a recurring figure, tall, shrouded in robes, with no visible face, but with eyes, so many eyes, covering the robe, glowing in the painted darkness. "The Watcher," whispered Father Thorne, crossing himself. "These paintings are centuries old. This didn't start with Lord Ashford. It didn't even start with this mansion. This place was built on something older, something that was already here." Lady Ashford paused, her face draining of color. "What do you mean?" "My husband built this library. He excavated these levels." Thorne shook his head slowly. "No, he discovered these levels. Look at the walls, Cordelia. This stone is centuries old, perhaps millennia old. Your husband didn't build a shrine. He reopened one." The fifth level was smaller, more claustrophobic, with a low ceiling that forced even the shortest members of the group to hunch over slightly. There were no organized bookshelves here, just stacks of books, loose scrolls, clay tablets with cuneiform writing, and Egyptian papyri unrolled on the floor. It was as if someone had dumped the contents of a dozen museums into a single room and left it to rot. And here, finally, they found the first body. It was Pemberton, the butler. He sat against a wall, his eyes open but lifeless, an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. There were no visible marks of violence, no wounds, no blood. It was as if his heart had simply stopped beating from sheer fear. In his hands, he held an open book. Dr. Voss knelt beside the body, checking his pulse out of professional habit. Though it was obvious he was dead, rigor mortis hasn't fully set in yet. He died a few hours ago, at most. She looked down at the book in her hands. He was reading when he died. Finch picked up the book carefully, turning it over to see the title. It was in Latin, but Gray immediately translated, De Natura Observatoris, on the nature of the Watcher. It's a 13th century treatise, supposedly written by the same monk who created the Testament. He adjusted his glasses, reading over Finch's shoulder. This page describes what happens when the Watcher is summoned. It says he doesn't kill directly. He simply watches, and those seen by him, those who meet his gaze, see the truth of their own existence. Every sin, every flaw, every moment of weakness magnified infinitely. And the human mind cannot bear this absolute truth. It simply shuts down. Madame Devereux recoiled, her voice breaking. So, we're all going to die like this? Stared at to death? Finch closed the book. No, Pemberton wasn't one of the 7. He was an innocent, caught in the crossfire. Whatever's happening here is focused on you, on the members of the Order. He looked around the group, which means there's still a chance. If we find out who orchestrated this, who sent the page, who's controlling events, maybe we can stop it before it's too late. Blackwood gestured to the stairs that continued downward. Then we must continue. The 6th level, and then the 7th. They left Pemberton's body where it lay. There was nothing more they could do for him now. The 6th level was the strangest yet. It was a single, long, narrow room, more of a corridor than a library, with shelves on either side containing only one type of book, journals, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, bound in leather of every color, each with a name engraved on the spine. Finch picked one at random. Jonathan Blackwood, 1823, 1847. He looked at Lord Edmund Blackwood. Your ancestor? Blackwood nodded slowly. My great-grandfather. He was a member of the Order a generation earlier. He looked around the room with growing horror. These are all the previous members of the Order? Over the centuries? Lady Ashford walked slowly around the room, her fingers touching the spines. My God, there are hundreds. The Order is much older than I imagined. She stopped before a particular diary, her hand trembling as she picked it up. Edmund Ashford, 1860, 1895. Her late husband's diary. She opened it to the last entry, and her voice broke as she read aloud. March 15th, 1895. Today I received confirmation that the final page exists and can be obtained. But the price is unacceptable. My correspondent demands that I gather all 7 and complete the ritual. He says the Watcher must be fed, that centuries of partial invocations have left him starving, trapped between worlds. I refused. Some knowledge is not worth the cost of human souls. But I fear my refusal will have consequences. I fear my correspondent will not take no for an answer. And I fear, most of all, that it is already too late for me. Lady Ashford closed the diary, tears streaming silently down her face. He tried to protect us, and he died for it. Finch gently placed a hand on her shoulder. And now we must finish what he started. We must descend to the 7th level. We must find the testament, and we need to find out who the correspondent is. Because that person is either here, now, among us, or controlling everything from somewhere in this library. He looked at the final staircase, which descended into absolute darkness. No lamps illuminated that path. It was like looking into the mouth of an abyss that led to nothingness. Who is ready to discover the truth? The descent to the 7th level was unlike any other. The staircase was narrower, the walls closer together, and with each step, the temperature dropped further, until the air became so cold it hurt to breathe. The lamps they carried began to flicker erratically, the flames shrinking as if something were sucking the oxygen from the air. Finch counted the steps in his mind. 33, a number he recognized from his studies of occult symbolism, the number of years of Christ, the number of degrees in Freemasonry, a number of power in countless esoteric traditions. Nothing in this library was accidental. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves before a door unlike any other they had seen. This one was not iron or wood, but solid stone, a single slab of polished black granite that reflected the lamplight like a dark mirror. There was no visible lock, no hinge, no obvious opening mechanism. Only symbols etched deeply into the surface. The Ouroboros at the center, surrounded by 7 smaller circles, each containing a different symbol. The 7 deadly sins. Lady Ashford approached the door, her silver key still in her hand, but there was obviously no place to insert it. "How did my husband open this?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. It was Professor Gray who answered, his voice trembling with academic excitement mixed with terror. "It's not a physical lock, it's a puzzle. Look at the circles. Each one must be pressed in the correct order." He pushed his glasses up his nose, studying the symbols. "But what order? There are thousands of possible combinations." Father Thorne stepped forward, his Bible still clutched to his chest. "Not thousands, just one. The order of the fall." He began pointing to each symbol. First, Superbia, pride, Lucifer's sin, the first to fall. Then, Invidia, envy, which led Cain to kill Abel. Then Ira, rage, which consumes reason. Avaritia, greed, which corrupts the soul. Luxuria, lust, which enslaves the body. Acedia, sloth, which kills the spirit. And finally, he paused, gluttony. But there is no symbol for gluttony here. There are only 6 circles around the central Ouroboros. Finch studied the door carefully. Because gluttony isn't represented by a circle, it's represented by the serpent in the center. The Ouroboros, eternally devouring itself. Endless consumption. Hunger that can never be satisfied. He looked at the group. 6 sins around, 1 in the center. 7 in total, like 7 members of the order. Blackwood frowned. "So we press the circles in that order? Pride, envy, wrath, greed, lust, sloth, and then the center?" Finch nodded. "But there's a problem. Each circle probably corresponds to a specific person. Remember the book. Each of you has been marked with a specific sin. This isn't just a puzzle. It's an acknowledgement, a confession." A heavy silence fell over the group. Finally, Blackwood stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Then so be it. I am Superbia, pride." He pressed hard on the first circle. The symbol glowed with a faint red light for a moment, then dimmed. A click resounded from within the stone. Lady Ashford was next, tears still in her eyes. "Invidia? Envy?" She touched the second circle, and again the red light. The click. Father Thorne didn't hesitate. Anger. Anger against God, against the world, against myself. The third circle. Dr. Voss, ever pragmatic, simply said, "Avaritia, greed for knowledge." The fourth circle. Madame Devereux, her theatricality completely gone, whispered, "Lust, not of the body, but of power over others." The fifth circle. And finally Professor Gray, visibly trembling, "Acedia, sloth of the soul, too cowardly to use my gifts." The sixth circle. All 6 symbols now glowed with a faint red light, pulsing like heartbeats. Only the central Ouroboros remained. But who should press it? Finch looked around the group. Tobias. He was the 7th. He completed the ritual. He is gluttonous, an insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge. Lady Ashford shook her head. "But Tobias isn't here. How can we—" Her voice trailed off as they realized they were no longer alone. From beyond the stone door, coming from within the 7th level, came the sound of something moving. Slow, shuffling footsteps, approaching. And then, impossible but undeniable, Tobias Crow's voice, distorted, echoing as if from a deep well. "I am here. I have always been. Waiting for you to come. Waiting for you to complete what I started." The door began to open on its own, the 6 circles glowing more brightly, the central Ouroboros slowly rotating. And beyond the door, in the darkness of the 7th level, they saw it. The 7th level wasn't a library. It was a cathedral, a vast circular chamber with a ceiling so high it was lost in the darkness, columns of black stone rising like petrified trees, and in the center, an altar of white marble stained red, and around the altar, figures. The missing servants, Mrs. Dawson, Mary, Elizabeth, Old Thomas, all standing in a circle, still as statues, eyes open but empty, and in the center, before the altar, stood Tobias Crow. But he was no longer the man they had known. He was standing, but his body was wrong. Joints bent at impossible angles, head tilted in a way no human neck should allow. And his eyes had multiplied. Not just the 2 normal eyes, but dozens of them, covering his face, his neck, his hands, all blinking independently, all focused on the entering group. "Welcome," Tobias said, but his mouth didn't move properly with the words. "Welcome to the true sanctuary. Welcome to the presence of the Watcher." He gestured to the altar, and it was then they saw what lay upon it, the Watcher's testament. It was no ordinary book. It was a massive tome, bound in what looked like tanned human skin, with bone clasps and pages that glowed with their own light. It was open to the last page, the final page that had been sent anonymously, and the words on the page. The words moved, rearranging themselves, forming new patterns as they watched. I read the words. Tobias continued, his voice now a dissonant harmony of multiple overlapping voices. I spoke the ritual, and he answered. He always answers those brave enough to call upon him. But the ritual was not complete, not with just one. He needs 7. 7 sinners, 7 souls, 7 sacrifices to fully manifest himself in this world. Finch stepped forward, placing himself between Tobias and the group. "Who sent the page, Tobias? Who is the correspondent who contacted Lord Ashford? Who orchestrated all of this?" Tobias, or the thing that had been Tobias, laughed, and the sound echoed through the cathedral like shattering glass. "Do you still not understand? Are you still searching for a human conspirator? For logic and reason in a world that transcends both?" He pointed to the altar, to the testament. "The correspondent is not a person. It is he. It has always been he. The Watcher is not passive. He does not wait to be summoned. He plants seeds, whispers in dreams, guides hands to write letters, manipulates events over decades, centuries, millennia, all for this moment, all to bring the 7 together." The realization hit Finch like a physical blow. There was no human conspirator. There was no villain to unmask, no culprit to apprehend. Everything, Lord Ashford's death, the sending of the page, Tobias's disappearance, even his own hiring, had all been orchestrated by something beyond human comprehension, something that operated on timescales that rendered human lives irrelevant. "Then there is no stopping this," Lady Ashford said, her voice empty of hope. "We are all doomed." Tobias tilted his head impossibly, all his eyes blinking in unison. "Doomed? No. Raised. Transformed. You will be the bridges between worlds, the vessels through which he will finally fully enter this reality. You should be honored." He extended a deformed hand toward the group. "Come, approach the altar, read the final words, complete the ritual. This is what you were born for. This is what you lived for. This is what you will die for." And it was in that moment, when all seemed lost, when logic and reason had utterly failed, that Finch noticed something. Something small, insignificant, but something his mind, trained to observe details, could not ignore. The servants around the altar, they were not completely still. Their fingers moved slightly, trembling. Their eyes, though empty, blinked occasionally. They were not dead. They were not possessed. They were paralyzed, drugged perhaps, or in a deep trance, but still alive, still human, which meant this was not supernatural, or at least, not completely. There was still a human element, a trick, an illusion, and if there was an illusion, there was a way to break it. Finch turned to Dr. Voss, keeping his voice low. "The servants, were they drugged?" Helena followed his gaze, her medical eyes assessing quickly. "Possibly. Some kind of strong sedative mixed with a hallucinogen. It would explain the catatonic state." Finch nodded. "And Tobias? The extra eyes? The impossible joints?" The doctor studied Tobias more carefully, then her eyes widened slightly. "Makeup, prosthetics. Very well done, but yes, it's possible. And the way he's standing, there are supports under his clothes, keeping him in position. He's not moving impossibly. He's being held up by a structure." Realization spread through the group like electricity. This was theater. Elaborate, terrifying, but theater nonetheless. Someone had staged all of this, drugged the servants, disguised Tobias, created the illusion of supernatural horror. But who and why? Finch turned slowly, studying each member of the order. One of them was lying. One of them had orchestrated all of this. And suddenly the pieces finally fell into place. The person with the medical knowledge to drug the servants. The person who had examined Tobias alone, having the opportunity to prepare him. The person who had suggested they all spend the night at the mansion, ensuring no one escaped. The person who had remained calm and clinical even when everyone else was panicking. "Dr. Voss," Finch said calmly, turning to face her. Or should I say, the correspondent. The silence that followed was absolute. Helena Voss stared at him for a long moment. her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she began to smile. And it wasn't the smile of a respectable doctor. It was the smile of someone who had waited decades for this moment. "Brilliant, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice losing its German accent, revealing something older beneath. "Truly brilliant. I wondered if anyone would notice before it was too late." She stepped back, placing herself beside Tobias. "But I fear your deduction, though impressive, comes too late. The ritual is already in motion. The 7 are gathered, and now..." She pulled something from her medical bag, not a medical instrument, but a ceremonial knife, the blade engraved with the same symbols that covered the walls. "Now, we complete what was begun centuries ago, and you, dear colleagues, will have the honor of feeding the Watcher with your souls." And as she spoke, the lamps around the cathedral began to dim, one by one, until only the ghostly light emanating from the testament above the altar remained. And in the growing darkness, something began to take shape, something vast, something with many eyes, something that had waited a long, long time to finally be seen.